First of all, can you actually zoom out even more? Like, because you mentioned ion
Yeah,
propulsion engine is a subset of
of the
electrical.
electric. Hmm.
So, like, maybe is there categories of electric engines, and then we can zoom in on ion propulsion?
Yes. So, sure. There's the two most kind of conventional types that have been around since the 60s are ion engines and Hall thrusters. And ion engines are a little bit simpler because they don't use a magnetic field for generating thrust. Um, and then there are also some other types of plasma engines, but that don't fit into those two categories. So just kind of other plasma, like a Vasimir engine, which we could get into. And then those are probably the main three categories that would be fun to talk about. Oh, and then of course the category of engine that I work on, which is has a lot of similarities to an ion engine, but could be considered its own class, called a colloid thruster.
Colloid. Cool. Okay. So, what is an ion engine?
Okay, so in an ion engine, you have an ionization chamber, and you inject the propellant into that chamber. And this is usually a neutral gas like xenon or argon. So you inject that into the chamber, and you also inject a stream of really hot, high energy electrons. And everything's just moving around very randomly in there. And the whole goal is to have one of those electrons collide with one of those neutral atoms and turn it into an ion. So kick off a secondary electron, and now you have
Plasma.
yes.
Okay.
And now you have and now you have a charged, xenon or argon ion and more electrons and so on. And then some fraction of those ions will happen to make it to this downstream electric field that we set up between two grids with holes in them.
Mm.
And, in terms of area, the same amount of those ions also runs into the walls and lose their charge. And that's where some of the inefficiencies come in. But the very lucky few make it to those holes in that grid. And they're two grids, actually, and you apply a voltage differential between them, and that sets up an electric field. And a charged particle in an electric field creates a force. And so those ions are accelerated out the back of the engine, and the reaction force is what pushes the spacecraft forward. If you're, following along and tallying these charges, now we've just sent a positive beam of ions out the back of the spacecraft. And for our purposes here, the spacecraft is neutral. So eventually, those ions will come back and hit the spacecraft because it's a positive beam. So you also have to have an external cathode producer of electrons outside the engine that pumps electrons into that beam and neutralizes that. So now it's net neutral everywhere, and it won't come back to the spacecraft. So that's an ion engine.
What temperature are we talking about here? So in terms of like the chemical-based engines, those are super hot. You mentioned plasma here. How hot does this thing get? I mean, is that an interesting thing to talk about in a sense that, is that an interesting distinction, or is heat? I mean, it's all going to be hot.
No, so it's important, especially for some of these smaller satellites people are into launching these days. So it's important because you have the plasma, but also those high energy electrons are hot. And if you have a lot of those that are going into the walls, you do have to care about the temperature. So I'm having trouble remembering off the top of my head. I think they're at like 100 electron volts in terms of the electron energy. And then I'd have to remember how to convert that into Kelvin.
Can you stick your hand in it? It's not room temperature.
Not recommended. Yeah.
Okay.